Hello, everyone. Good evening, New York 14. My name is Kayla Fermate, and I am the Legislative Fellow with the Office of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Thank you so much for joining our Thank you so much for joining our joint town hall tonight with Representative Jared Huffman. We're hosting this town hall together because as members of the Progressive Caucus, both representatives have been fighting so hard to protect the president's investment in childcare, pre-K, expanding Medicare, climate change, and more, all of which we'll be dedicating to explain more in tonight's town hall. Just a few notes of housekeeping before we start. For folks who are logged into Zoom meeting, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. We also are prioritizing questions from our constituents, so please make sure that you're stating your neighborhood, where you're from, whether it be California Congressional District 2 or New York Congressional District 14. Alternatively, you can email your questions to huffingtonqa@mail.house.gov, aoctownhall@mail.house.gov, or you can call in at 718-662-5970. Our team members will be closely monitoring the inbox and the phones. We are also live on Congress members' Facebook page and broadcasting the town hall on Twitter Spaces. So please feel free to visit our Facebook or Twitter to live stream this town hall. We are also live on KSRO, Marin TV, KPAC, and KMUD. Open caption is also being provided by All Hands in Motion. If you click the link in the chat, it will take you to a website where you can view the transcriptions. For today's town hall, we will be hearing from the representatives about their work to advance the president's agenda on the Build Back Better by investing in our nation's physical and social infrastructure. We will be opening it up for Q&A from the constituents, and after that, there will be a press gaggle where we will have members of the press be able to pose questions. And now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Representative from New York's 14th Congressional District, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to give her remarks.
Thank you so much, Kayla, for moderating, and thank you so much to Representative Huffman, who's joining us, and we're teaming up this month for a joint town hall. So I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's joining us, whether you're in Northern California from Representative Huffman's district or right here in New York City in my district. So thank you so much for hopping on. And for those of you who don't know, Representative Huffman is a proud fellow Progressive Caucus member. And he is a colleague that I'm so proud to work with as a climate hawk in Congress, as he describes himself. And he really is, and it's really wonderful to have such strong climate champions as we really advocate to advance the principles of the Green New Deal and overall meet our carbon targets as well as our environmental justice goals. So we'll just hop right into it. I'll try to breeze through this as much as I can because I do believe that we had a lot of this conversation at last month's town hall about what the current situation is with the infrastructure package. Now, there were a few developments over that and since last month, but the overall framework of what we're working with is still pretty similar. So in the actual infrastructure, we have two pieces of legislation that are very critical. We have a smaller bipartisan bill that contains and is largely contained to some aspects of physical infrastructure. And this was the bill that started off in the Senate. There's some investment on transit, and I wouldn't even say really mass transit, but some investment in roads, bridges, etc. There are physical infrastructure investments in here, like investments in helping rebuild our national power grid, etc. And this was largely developed between Republicans and a few Democrats in the House. Now we also have the reconciliation bill, which is known as the Build Back Better Act. And the Build Back Better Act is the big, I call them both infrastructure bills, but the reconciliation package is much bigger. It contains, I would say, the lion's share of President Biden's overall infrastructure agenda, which includes not only some pieces of physical infrastructure, but really also focuses on the social infrastructure that underpins our economy and our society overall. And what we mean by that, and I think as we see with some of the employment data, for example, the Wall Street Journal came out with an article this week talking about how there are 4.3 million workers who still have yet to re-enter the economy since last year, and kind of asking some of the questions as to why. And there are a lot of reasons why. Lack of healthcare, lack of childcare are big driving reasons why. And, of course, when you pair that with lower wages and the lack of ability for a lot of people to collectively organize for better working conditions, leads to really an assessment of, is this worth it? And for a huge chunks of our economy and our society, the trade-off actually isn't worth it. And we can see that evidenced by which populations I think our employers or our economy are seeing having more trouble, I would say, luring back to work. So who are these folks that are choosing to stay home because of working conditions? And as we say, it's not really a labor shortage, it's a dignified work shortage. It's a living wage shortage. It's a healthcare shortage. And that is creating a lack of appetite for people to say, I don't think that this is worth it. And so I think it's important for us to talk about that, because when you look at the actual dynamics of who's reentering the workforce and who's reentering employment and who isn't, it's disproportionately women, working class people, lower wage employees. And the types of work that and the types of jobs that people are not returning to are also important. Childcare, teaching, retail, and other things like food service. And these really tell, I think, the whole story, a big story of what's actually happening in our economy. So how does this tie back into the reconciliation bill? Well, if your wages are low, if it's very difficult for you to collectively organize or unionize your workplace, if the cost of childcare is pretty much your entire paycheck, then it's not going to be worth it to go to work. And the reconciliation bill really fills the missing puzzle pieces for our economic infrastructure in order for us to not only have the services that we need, but for us to be actually happier and more dignified in our lives. So things like universal pre-K, childcare, expansion of Medicare, as well as really important climate provisions, and also those other pieces of infrastructure that are really important too. Investments in mass transit, et cetera. All of these, with both of these packages put together, will be able to really have the tools that we need to not just survive past this pandemic, but to set up our society to thrive with the challenges that we're going to be facing and the evolving forces that we're going to be facing in the time to come. So this question about, you're seeing in news, there's all this fighting in the party, there's moderates, there's conservatives, there's progressives. There actually isn't that much fighting, I would say, within the caucus. I think the caucus has probably seen more contentious moods and tensions in the past. But the fact of the matter is that 96% of the Democratic Party, of members of the Democratic Party, are in agreement. We need to pass both bills. It's really just 4% of the party. And when you really, really narrow it down, as President Biden has said, 2 senators that are essentially in disagreement with the rest of the Democratic Party. And so the thing that's been very important to us is that when people say, oh, well, isn't something better than nothing? Can't you just pass this kind of Republican approved bill and then you can deal with reconciliation later? The reason we can't, and I think it's my assessment, perhaps it's Representative Huffman's assessment. I don't want to speak for him, but what I'll say is that it's my assessment that if we pass this very tiny, underfunded, bipartisan bill, not only will our community not really experience any of the benefits from that bipartisan bill, because that bipartisan bill largely benefits the very small handful of senators who helped draft it. But for example, all the NYCHA funding stripped out of that bipartisan bill. The really important mass transit investments that we really need are not in that bipartisan bill. And so a lot of this is like kind of more larger highways, et cetera, which of course there are some surrounding our city, but the most important things that we need are in the reconciliation bill. And it's my assessment that if we pass this bipartisan bill alone, the reconciliation bill will be dead in the water. There's no incentive for the reconciliation bill to pass through. So that's why we've insisted that we want to succeed together. And we've insisted on ensuring that all of our successes are bound up with one another, and both of these bills are bound up with one another, which is why you may have seen some headlines over the past month about the Progressive Caucus making a stand. And I found this moment to be really inspiring and really, really important, because if, for example, you take the climate crisis, if the bipartisan bill alone was passed, it's my assessment that the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the passage of that alone, would actually increase our fossil fuel emissions and worsen our climate crisis. But the reconciliation bill, when paired with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, actually helps take us into territory where we are contributing to global drawdown of emissions, which, you know, there are few things more important globally than staving off a, species-wide and planetary crisis. So what else is in the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill? In addition to universal pre-K, childcare subsidies, there's paid family and medical leave. There's more affordable housing. There is billions of dollars to help pay for the NYCHA backlogs and investment, increases in Pell Grants for college, the Civilian Climate Corps, clean energy standards, EV incentives, tax incentives to make it easier for people to purchase things like not only electric cars, but also electrified bicycles, polluter import fees, and very, very critically for our community, immigration reform measures, which we can get into the latest status on that fight as well. The one thing that I will say is that there's been so much discussion about the number, 3.5 trillion, 2, 1, et cetera. And what I think is really important is that, yes, the number is what we invest, how much we invest is a really critical question, but how we invest is just as important. Because one of the tricks I think that we often see in media is that when we talk about investing in schools, in healthcare, in housing, for some reason, we always revert to a 10-year price tag. But when we're talking about militarization budgets, whether it's the NDAA or whether we're talking about any other forms of militarization, we talk in 1-year figures. So 3.5 trillion, that sounds like a huge number, except this is how much we're investing over a decade, the initial proposal at least. And that only amounts to about $350 billion per year nationwide. Now, for context, this year, we just passed a $768 billion defense budget alone, just for 1 year. And so if you were to kind of scope out the decade price tag for our defense budget alone, which, by the way, is a huge source of our country's climate emissions as well, that's a 7.7-ish trillion dollar price tag. And so I want us to be very conscious of this figure. It's not as big as I would say a lot of headlines would have you believe. Of course, we actually pushed for it to be much higher. I do believe it needs to be higher. But that is why it's been very important for us to say, you know what, even if you see this number change, what matters is how we invest it. So 3.5 trillion over 10 years is about 1.75 trillion over 5 years. And so that's why the top line number alone isn't what defines, again, alone isn't the sole indicator of the success of the investments that's happening. And as we know, we've passed huge packages in Congress that have big price tags that disproportionately benefit the wealthy and the powerful. And we've had smaller packages that are tailored to working class people. And our work is we're trying to reverse that trend. But again, I think it's really important that this isn't just about the price tag. This isn't just about how much, it's about what it does and in what timeline it does it. So I think, is that my last slide? I think I can hand the rest off to our partner in legislating, Representative Huffman.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and hello, everyone. I am so excited to partner with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in this joint town hall. You may look at our respective districts. I've got the North Coast of California. She's got the Bronx. These are obviously different geographies, different composition of our district, but we both represent incredibly smart, engaged, passionate constituents, and I'm so honored to share the stage. Let me just say to the good people of the Bronx, thanks for sending such an incredibly effective member of Congress for me to work with. Alexandria is just a great ally. She's one of the best communicators the Congress has seen in many, many years, but she's a huge ally for me on what I regard as the most important existential, economic, and social justice and environmental issue of our time, and that is confronting this climate crisis. What she has brought in terms of energy, in terms of diversity, in terms of just so many new voices and champions to this cause is really welcome from my perspective. And I say that as someone who's been in the trenches working on this for many, many years. So great to be with all of you. I'm going to pick up where she left off to talk a little about the status of the negotiations. And as I describe sort of where this stands, I'm going to agree with my colleague that there's a lot of mischaracterizations and misunderstandings about what's really going on here. Starting with the fact that the narrative that there's this huge divide among Democrats. There's really not. What Representative Ocasio-Cortez and I and our progressive colleagues and President Biden and our House leadership and the Senate leadership and 96% of our colleagues in the House and the Senate are all standing for, fighting for, is the full vision of President Biden's jobs and people agenda. We're pretty unified around all of that. And although we have a few challenges in the House, we can do all of this, I believe, in the House. It really does come down to two senators who need to be brought along. And that's when I talk about the status of negotiations, I'm pretty much talking about those two senators. So let's just be really clear about that. Now, the other misunderstanding, I think, is, is there some deadline? Is there some hard and fast deadline to get this done? We know that the House passed a rule a few weeks ago that set September 27th as some line in the sand deadline where we were supposed to take up the Senate infrastructure bill. That wasn't a real deadline. That was just something that some members of Congress demanded to see in a rule. And as it happens so often with the work we do in Congress, it didn't prove to be practicable. We were not going to have the votes to pass that bill. And so I think there's too much attention given to some of these artificial constraints like deadlines. I will say, though, having that deadline out there was kind of useful because it put some pressure on everyone, including the White House, to get fully engaged and to really try to draw out these two U.S. senators, get their cards on the table. And they have not put their cards on the table sufficiently for us to get to where I think most of us want to be. Why is that? because they may say, well, it's too expensive, or, well, that's too much social spending, and these other generalities that you hear from some of their public statements. But if you look at the individual components of what's in the Build Back Better Act, and Representative Ocasio-Cortez just walked you through many of those, every one of them is wildly popular. We're not asking anyone to take a tough vote politically by passing the Build Back Better Act. In fact, it is far tougher to have to explain, as these two senators now must, what part do you not support? What part has to come out? And frankly, that's why negotiations are really tough right now, because they're standing in the way of doing something really transformative, maybe the biggest thing we've done since the New Deal in terms of transforming people's lives, certainly the biggest thing we've ever done to confront this existential threat of the climate crisis. And it's hard for them to explain why they're against it, because it's all so very, very popular and important with the American people. So there is no hard and fast deadline. We extended the Department of Transportation temporary funding to the end of this month. If we don't get this deal done by then, we will need to extend that funding again. That's easy enough to do. But it's okay, I think, to regard that as a goal, a deadline, if you will. And I hope that that brings some urgency and focus to these negotiations. We're depending heavily on the White House, frankly, to get it done with these two U.S. senators. Our Progressive Caucus is fully engaged. Certainly, our leadership has been great about keeping us at the table. That's why I think there's been so much unity among House Democrats to date. The hard part is at least one of these U.S. senators won't tell anyone except the White House the bottom line. And so, public pressure is useful. Political pressure is useful. I think that is all building in a way that will help get this further down the road. But all of us are counting, I think, on this, the master of the Senate, Joe Biden, coming through in what is setting up to be a bit of a Biden moment, I think, where his unique experience and knowledge of the Senate and deal-making skill is going to probably be what gets this across the finish line. One last note about the price tag. Alexandria talked about the fact that there's too much fixation, I think, on this top-line number that doesn't necessarily mean much. What does mean a lot is what's in it. But what you should know about these numbers that you hear, if it's $3.5 trillion for the Build Back Better Act, that's not $3.5 trillion in borrowing or in debt, because what we propose is fully paid for through common sense and wildly popular tax fairness measures, making these powerful, wealthy corporations that evade taxes every single year finally pay their fair share, making the wealthiest Americans, the top 1%, pay a little more. They got a huge windfall in 2017 under Donald Trump. They need to pay a little more in order to make all this happen. But if we do that, this will be fully paid for. And in fact, we will be cutting taxes and reducing financial burdens on the middle class in some really, really meaningful ways. Now, flip over to that Senate bipartisan bill. It is not paid for. It has the halo of bipartisanship that you hear sometimes from the media, but it's not paid for. It's just full of gimmicks that are sort of posing as paid for. So that does go straight to the debt. And you hear all kinds of crazy numbers about that package. I've heard everything from 1.1 to 1.2 trillion. It's actually 550 billion of additional spending on top of what we were already going to do. And again, if you take that out over the 10-year funding window, as Representative Ocasio-Cortez reminded us we need to do, it's about $55 billion a year more than we were already going to spend. It's not very transformative. It's got some problems in it. It was negotiated behind closed doors with a lot of concessions to the fossil fuel industry. So last point I'll make on the state of negotiations, this something versus nothing false choice that seems to get thrown out all the time. Shouldn't you just take a little something? Isn't that better than nothing? What you need to know is that for many people, when they hear you should take something rather than nothing, what they really hear is I should get something and you may end up getting nothing. That's the way it's tended to go for many communities that we're trying to help here. But the truth is we can do a heck of a lot better than that little something in that bipartisan Senate bill. We've got a historic, once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to do something big. And by the way, when you think about the climate crisis, this may be our last opportunity. So that's not something that you just trade away lightly in order to take that halo of bipartisanship that may or may not belong on that Senate bill. So that's sort of where we are. I do think the rest of this month is going to be critical, and I think our success in getting over the finish line will come down largely to President Biden's ability to bring these two U.S. senators along. I'm excited to jump into your questions. Thanks again, Alexandria, for partnering with me on this. Ready to go.
Of course. Thank you so much, Jared.
I'd like to thank you so much for your remarks. Now we're going to be moving on to the Q&A portion of the town hall. As previously stated, those constituents who are joining us via Zoom, please feel free to use the Q&A section to ask your questions. Also, please don't forget to put your congressional district and what town or neighborhood you're from. Lastly, I want to remind members of the press that we will have a gaggle after the Q&A section where you will be able to ask your questions to both of the representatives. So without further ado, we'll stop sharing my screen. Okay. First question is from a constituent from New York. Okay. Gianni asks, Gianni from Morris Park asks, as we look into the future and better infrastructure, we remain concerned about the decrease of union construction progress in New York. How does this agenda promote and encourage developers to utilize safer practices and hire union workers?
Thank you so much, Kayla. And thank you, Gianni, for such an awesome question. One of the things that actually wasn't in that slide of what's in the reconciliation bill that I'm very excited about is the inclusion of the PRO Act and major components of the PRO Act in the overall reconciliation bill. And so what is the PRO Act? Well, as we mentioned earlier, right now, due to just decades and decades of, just union busting legislation that's been passed year after year, sometimes very quietly and slipped into larger pieces of legislation, the ability for us to organize and unionize our workplaces has been chipped away to an incredibly, incredibly weak level. And we kind of saw this a little bit earlier this year with the attempts to unionize at Amazon down in Alabama, I believe, earlier this year, as well as even we see there's a unionization showdown happening with Starbucks up in Buffalo, upstate. I'm going to get in trouble for saying upstate. Everyone always gets in trouble for saying upstate. But anyways, I'm from the Bronx, so I'm going to call Buffalo upstate. So anyways, I think what we see sometimes is these employers doing absolutely ridiculous things. And we ask ourselves, how is this possibly legal? For example, with what we saw with workers who are trying to unionize in Buffalo, the local Starbucks in the area required them to attend mandatory anti-unionization meetings while they were on the clock. How is stuff like that legal when the right to organize and unionize is supposed to be constitutionally protected? Well, that's the reason that employers and corporations are able to do this is because of how much the right to unionize has been chipped out and labor protections have been chipped away for decades. So the PRO Act in the reconciliation package dramatically expands the labor protections and the right to unionize one's workplace. So overall, the more people start to organize their workplaces, the more the more we elevate the standards of the labor market so that wages are higher, benefits are better, people can provide for their families on reasonable hours worked per week. But also, the other component beyond the PRO Act is that in specific federal contracting, we will invest and only give you certain federal investment if you are a unionized workplace. And so for all of this infrastructure investment, for example, EVs. With electric vehicles, we are trying to bring the manufacturing and development of electric vehicles here to the United States. And we don't want to just produce here, but we want to produce here with a unionized workforce. And so everything from EV tax credits to, for example, when we start to electrify our postal fleet, we want all of that investment to go to unionized workplaces. And I think similar rules can apply for construction and development. And so a lot of people really don't understand the absolutely huge scale that federal investment takes up and federal contracting takes up in our economy. And so when the federal government says, we're only going to contract, or you're only going to get this tax incentive or this tax benefit if your workers are unionized, or if you're paying a living wage, et cetera, that is what is going to really help, I think, drive and lead competition in the labor market and what that means is elevated standards for everybody. So Jared, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, that was great. And thanks for bringing in the EV tax credits, because that's a great example of, one of the many ways we're promoting union jobs. And that includes not just you got to make it in the United States. It's got to be union labor if you're going to get the full benefit of that tax credit. But it's got to use batteries that are manufactured in the United States using union labor. So it's one of the many really good pieces of the Build Back Better Act. And prevailing wage for everything on that side of the package. The Senate package is really missing a lot of these key labor protections. And it's another reason why it's really important that we do this bigger, more important piece of the infrastructure package.
Thank you both so much for your responses. I'm going to move on to the second question. Our second question is from Laurel Farnham from Fortuna, California. From what I am hearing on public radio, there is now no mention of negotiating drug prices with the pharmaceutical companies. Has this been removed from Build Back Better legislation? And if so, why?
I'll dive in to start us on that. Thank you for that question. Giving HHS the ability to just do the obvious, to negotiate drug prices like everyone else does with pharma, is so important to getting a handle on our skyrocketing prescription drug costs and making healthcare more affordable to everyone in this country. The fact that we can't do it is shameful. It's all about special interest influence. But the short answer to your question is no, it hasn't been removed from the Build Back Better Act, but it's going to be a tough sell. To be perfectly honest. Now, we have passed prescription drug pricing reform out of the House of Representatives before. We could do it again. We lose very few of our members on that. The Senate's a different place. The margins are non-existent. It's a 50-50 Senate. And one of those two senators that we've been talking about is the top recipient of pharma campaign contributions in the universe. So she doesn't like that provision and has made it pretty clear. So I don't like, bearing this bad news, but I think the political odds of that making the final cut are difficult. It doesn't mean we won't fight for it. It doesn't mean we won't keep trying to do it if it doesn't make the final Build Back Better Act. But the politics are going to be tricky in the Senate. Alexandria, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the role, it's so funny how the entire world looks at Washington and our whole country looks at Washington and they see the role of big money and we all see the role of dark money. And it's so obvious to everybody what is going on. Yet when we are in these spaces and we're in legislative bodies, it's like supposed to be some big elephant in the room, which I don't really understand because everyone else already knows the score. But anyways, I do think that, the role of big pharma is coming in really high in these negotiations. But is it gone? No, it's not gone. And I think to Representative Huffman's point earlier, the reason why you hear from some of these senators, I think it's important to also state that, we have two holdouts, but they're not holding out for the same things. And they're not holding out on the same exact agenda. They all kind of have different demands, differing preferences. et cetera, which dramatically complicates the narrative because it's not Manchin and Sinema are making XYZ demands. But then on top of that, you also have folks like Senator Sinema saying, I negotiate with the White House and the White House only. But it's the House of Representatives' fault for holding up both of these two bills. And so she is not publicly stating her opposition to having Medicare, for example, negotiate prescription drug prices and lower the cost of prescription drugs. And that's a very difficult kind of negotiating partner to deal with, because in all relationships, political or not, communication is most important. And so when you have someone saying, I'm not going to negotiate with you, I'm going to go to this third party, I'm only going to tell them my preferences, I will not make those preferences public, I won't even tell you what those preferences are, but I'm going to make demands of you. Take that out of any ideological frame. That is just like, what do you do with that? And so we hear that a lot of this opposition is related to oppositions against corporate tax increases and prescription drugs and keeping prescription drugs expensive. Now, if there's anything that I would say, any one issue that has united the House Democratic Caucus, from some of our most conservative members to some of our most liberal members, it is bringing down the cost of medicine. And it is a profoundly uniting, extremely popular provision, because who doesn't want to afford their medicine? So I think what we're really going to need is, and I want to also thank our community and our district for being so supportive and actually understanding what the stakes here are. And I think this is one of the reasons why Representative Huffman and I also wanted to have a joint town hall, is to really make sure that we are also, that we're not only putting on our hats as representatives, but that we are also encouragers of you all, because your support and your political support, your acknowledgement, and your understanding as to why it is important for us to stay strong in this is why we even have hope of bringing down prescription medications, a path to citizenship, combating our climate crisis, childcare, healthcare, et cetera. Because if you all didn't have that support, we would be in really big trouble right now, I would say, as a country.
Thank you both so much. I received a message from our interpreters asking if we can possibly just speak a little slower so they can have the opportunity to translate for our constituents. But I'm going to move on to the third question. Our third question is from Glenn Ilian from Petaluma. His question is, there is so much talk about raising taxes, but I hear nothing about closing loopholes that allow large companies to pay no income taxes, nor talk about how you are going to go after tax cheaters. Why don't you focus on this rather than raising taxes on those who make more than $500,000 annually?
So I know this comes from one of my constituents, but I think in light of the dress that you wore to the Met Gala, Alexandria, I really need to defer to you to take the first stab at this.
Of course. Thank you. One of my favorite topics. So I do actually think that, when we talk about the pay-fors, in how this huge investment package is actually accounted for, how we support it financially. A lot of it isn't just tax increases on households making more than $400,000 or $500,000. A lot of it is actually in closing a lot of those loopholes, and it is in making sure that IRS enforcement for the ultra wealthy is really tight and tied up. We saw during the course of the pandemic, trillions of dollars in private wealth have been accrued over the last year among just a handful of billionaires alone. And as we saw from the ProPublica papers, many ultra high net worth people are exploiting loopholes, and they're also counting on lack of IRS enforcement into auditing or actually looking into the actual tactics that are used. And the reason for this is because, over the last several years, but especially during the Trump administration, IRS budgets have been cut. And it's a lot easier to audit a poor person who just has a W-2 and a couple of write-offs than it is to audit a billionaire, which requires forensic accountants and tons of resources to audit. And so what we're trying to do with the Reconciliation Act is fix that injustice, because what we saw is that low-income people were getting audited at sky-high rates that are really just completely unjustified when the vast majority of tax skirting is happening among ultra-high net worth individuals. So there are some proposed changes. Closing tax loopholes is a big pay for in the reconciliation package. And I would also argue that a lot of the tax increases that we see, even though you see this number of 400,000 or 500,000, the actual concentration of it is in net worths that are much higher than that, and incomes that are higher than that as well.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to agree and say loophole closing is one of the three revenue pillars of this package. So making the wealthy individuals pay their fair share, and then making corporations pay their fair share. Those are the other two. And combined, they fully pay for the Build Back Better Act. But you're absolutely right in asking this question about tax evasion. We know that the 50 biggest corporations in the country over just last year paid zero in taxes, and that was on $40 billion in profits, paid zero taxes. And there's so many other examples. Alexandria referred to the ProPublica papers. I think those are being referred to as the Pandora papers. And what was fascinating to me about that, it explains how, these Russian oligarchs and sultans and everyone else are moving their money to the Cayman Islands and all of these other offshore tax havens to avoid taxation. And you didn't see a lot of American billionaires in those Pandora papers. Why? Not because they don't want to avoid taxes and aren't willing to do elaborate things to avoid taxes. It's because we've made it so easy for them to do it right here in the United States in plain sight that they don't have to jump through those hoops. So it's a real problem, and we do have to address it. The other piece of this, though, is I think what President Biden has been trying to negotiate with the other major countries of the world, and that is a minimum corporate tax that'll be enforced all over the world so that we can avoid this Pandora's box game of tax evasion altogether. So thanks for that question.
Of course. Question 4 is from Nancy from the Bronx. She asks, is there any way to bypass Senator Manchin and Sinema to pass the climate change bill / reconciliation package originally proposed by the progressive leaders in the House?
If only, Nancy. You ever see that meme when they're like, if, XYZ happens? The last one I saw is like, if everyone learned how to correctly pronounce Chipotle society, and then it's like a super ultra modern society with like maglev trains and everything like that. That's sometimes how I feel if we could pass legislation with 48 senators. Unfortunately, the whole reason we're in this mess is because of the Senate. We have a 50-50 Senate, and the tie-breaking vote then goes to the vice president. But aside from that, we have 50 Democratic senators and 50 Republican senators. There is not a single Republican that will cross the aisle in order to support childcare and healthcare and lower prescription drug prices for the country, which is a whole different situation in and of itself. But unfortunately, we need every single Democratic vote in order to pass this legislation. Now, one of the reasons that I think, that's the bad news. In a weird way, the good news is that the House margin is also almost just as slim. We can only afford to lose 4 votes. And in some ways, I would actually say that that's a much more difficult task of holding that caucus together, because the Senate has 50 members. The House, we have well above 200 members that all need to be in alignment. And if you can only lose 4 out of 230 odd members, that's a huge challenge. And so I think that one of the things that's important is that we can also use that slim House margin to our advantage as well. And so for every mansion in the Senate, there is a Huffman and an Ocasio-Cortez in the House, because while conservatives may be the center of political gravity in the Senate, I don't want to toot a horn or anything, but I would say that progressives have been really the center of that margin gravity in the House. And so just like we need Manchin to vote for our legislation, Manchin needs us to pass his legislation. And we can use that tension, the way that we are proposing that we resolve that tension is by ensuring each other's success. Because in any other circumstance, would I be voting for this bipartisan bill? No, I would not. I do not like this legislation. I don't think it is positive, but I think there are some investments that are positive, but with the understanding that if passing this bill is the only way that we can guarantee passage of reconciliation, then that's a hit I'm willing to take. But what I'm not going to do is allow for the passage of legislation that could be potentially harmful for nothing, especially to our communities, which are underserved and marginalized and continually ignored. We cannot let that happen, and we cannot afford to leave communities behind anymore.
Yeah. I'll just add that a big part of our frustration, the reason why we ask questions like, can't we just bypass these 2 U.S. senators, is this relic of the Jim Crow era called the filibuster. And it is so important that we disabuse ourselves of some notion that the filibuster is some great comity building, institutional, sacred, romanticized thing that's really important. It's not. It's a sinister thing. It's an anti-democratic thing. It's not in the Constitution. Our framers would be horrified by the notion that you got to get to 60 in order to pass something out of the United States Senate. But it came along during the Jim Crow era mainly to prevent civil rights from moving forward. And it has been used in mostly sinister ways ever since. So I think if we take a good clear-eyed look at that, realize that if and when Mitch McConnell ever gets the Senate majority back, he's going to do away with it because he's heartless and wants all of his justices confirmed. And he's done it to us so many times before. So let's be done with the filibuster. That'll make it a lot easier to address our frustrations with these 2 U.S. senators.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to our next question. I think this one hasn't been talked about yet, so it'll be exciting to hear both of your answers. Liz Finn from Sebastopol has this burning question. The burning issue for me is legalization and pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented residents who enrich our daily lives, both economically and culturally. What actions are you taking to make sure there is a pathway of citizenship and that it stays in the reconciliation bill?
Yeah, I'll dive in. So, as we know, this is a centrally important issue in our community. More than 50% of our district comes from immigrant families. And this is, as we know, in our community, it is such a central issue. It's an issue of survival. It's an issue of dignity. And it's an issue of recognition and citizenship. And at its core, citizenship is about being a fully recognized member of the society that we participate in. And so I'll start off with a status update, because when we last spoke, the strategy that we had laid out, the strategy that was before us to have immigration and a path to citizenship in the reconciliation package was to simply put it in and then see what the parliamentarian says as the bounds, and to just have the full path to citizenship that includes vulnerable communities like that are not only the fully undocumented essential workers and frontline workers, but also TPS recipients, dreamers, documented youth. Although, DACA people DACA recipients are around my age and older. So people keep talking about DACA recipients as though we're teenagers, and it's like, not anymore. And farm workers as well. So the first piece of news, which was the bad news, was that the parliamentarian ruled that including the full path to citizenship as drafted in the reconciliation package was a violation of the Byrd rule, which is, by the way, a Senate-only rule. It is totally fine, and it passed the House with no issue. Again, one of the reasons why the Senate is a fundamentally undemocratic institution, the idea that a parliamentarian is given such broad, legislatively impactful power is a problem. And this rule is arbitrary, and it's also changeable. That's the other issue that we have as well, but that's an aside. And so the first proposal was ruled out of order. So the second attempt was to say, okay, what we're going to do then is just update the kind of Reagan era registry date when we kind of had that amnesty in 1986, and move it from, if you arrived to the United States before 1986, you can have a path to citizenship, and just move that number all the way up to 2010. If you arrived here before 2010, we will be able to really carve out a path to citizenship. The parliamentarian has ruled that out as well. And I'm going to check myself, because I shouldn't really use the word rule, because the parliamentarian is not a judge, and the parliamentarians, the parliamentarian actually issues guidance, not really a ruling, it's guidance. And her guidance is that these two provisions are a violation of the Byrd rule. There are a couple of paths before us now. There's a legislative path where we go back to the drawing board and we say, okay, how can we make this work? Right now, I think the current status of that is to hedge it a little bit even more and to talk about a very expanded work authorizations and starting to really document the undocumented as almost a third option. Then the other option, I would say procedurally, is overruling the parliamentarian, which was something that we tried to do earlier this year in trying to pass a $15 minimum wage with the first reconciliation bill. And what we saw with the passage of, or the attempt to pass 15 an hour, was that we lost about 10 senators in overruling the parliamentarian. But at the same time, that was then for a different provision. There's concern that we've heard that, perhaps this is a precedent issue, that, those 10 senators' opposition, the nature of their opposition is important. If they were opposed to actually raising it to a $15 minimum wage, then maybe we can think about this again, because this is a separate topic and issue. But also you have the vice president in her parliamentary role. But the concern here is the appetite for members of the Senate to be willing to vote for a bill that overruled the parliamentarian's guidance. But the fact of the matter remains that there is a procedural path to overrule the parliamentarian's guidance. So the question is really not one of procedural possibility or legal possibility. It's a question of political will. And it's most specifically a question of the Senate's political will. And so that, I think, is the active dynamic that we're trying to suss out right now in figuring out the path ahead.
I'll just quickly agree. This is a question of political will. And the broader political context is that, unfortunately, in the last few years, compassion for immigrants and support for immigration reform has gone from something that was broadly bipartisan, that President Ronald Reagan spoke eloquently about in his final address to the nation, to something that is deeply hyper-partisan and divisive. And we can't get any Republicans, frankly, to join us at this point in supporting meaningful immigration reform. That's why we have to try to squeeze it through budget reconciliation, and it's why we have all of these Byzantine conversations about bird rules and parliamentarians. It's undemocratic. It's really tragic politically, but that's the current state of play, unfortunately. We'll keep passing good immigration reform legislation out of the House, and we'll keep trying to figure out this hurdle of Senate parliamentarian challenges.
Thank you both so much. So we're coming on our last and final question for the constituent part of the town hall. Our last question is from Elizabeth Connor. What can we do as individuals on the ground to help ensure that the Build Back Better plan passes in Congress?
Well, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I'll start off and let you close us out on this, if that's all right. I think this is one of those moments where the people of this country can just make an enormous difference. Speaker Nancy Pelosi likes to often quote Abraham Lincoln as on the importance of public opinion, that without it, you can't do anything. With it, anything is possible. And we've seen that time and again, as recently as just a few years ago when Republicans had the White House, the Senate, and the House. Their number one agenda was to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And the people of this country said no and started showing up. And there was this awakening, and people came to their offices, they came into the streets, and public opinion saved the day. We still have an Affordable Care Act. In fact, we're expanding the Affordable Care Act right now. And, Representative Ocasio-Cortez and I would like to go all the way to Medicare for all with that expansion one of these days. But the public and all of you, frankly, as engaged, active citizens showing up, raising your voices, are going to have a huge amount to say about whether we get the Build Back Better Act over the finish line, especially if you focus some of that voice raising on the states of West Virginia and Arizona in the weeks ahead. So thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, mass mobilization works. It works. And I think sometimes one of the most common mistakes sometimes that people make is that they'll look at their representative and they'll be like, well, my representative is great. They represent me. I don't need a call. I don't need to do anything, because they always, even if they like them, even if I like them, I don't have to worry about them. I never have to worry about Representative Huffman. You don't have to worry about, it's still so impactful for you to still call us and express your viewpoint, because at least what that gives, it gives us tools and evidence and numbers to also make our case to others. Representative Huffman can probably speak to this, but this past month, he actually encouraged me. Thank you, Jared, for encouraging me, because we were in a Democratic meeting. They're closed door. I won't go into the details of it, but I was bummed out. Okay, I was bummed out because I had felt in the moment that our party was starting to cave and crumble, and it was going to mean that our community was once again going to be ignored and underserved. And I was bummed out about it. And so I was going to stand up and say something. And then everyone else started talking about a different topic. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to save it. I'm not even going to bother right now. It's 9:30 in the morning. I'm going to try to channel my energy and advocacy in other ways. So Jared walks out to me and he goes, no, what were you going to do? What were you going to say? Go up there and say something. Say what you're going to say. And I said, you know what? Okay, fine. So I go up there, and the thing that I had tried to express to our caucus was that it was some of what Jared had expressed earlier. When people say, don't you want something rather than nothing? Our community knows. In the Bronx and in Jackson Heights and in Queens, we've seen this story play out so many times. And what it means is, isn't a little something for West Virginia, or isn't a little something for Big Pharma better than nothing at all, which also translates something for somebody else and nothing for us. And I think sometimes it's not that people are often operating with malice, but that they operate with blind spots to the realities of other communities. And because something may be helping their community a little bit, they assume that it's helping all communities a little bit. And it's not. But the other thing that I said was that other members I was like, you guys don't understand the calls that are coming into my office. I cannot go home without fighting for immigration and a path to citizenship. I can't do it. I might as well not even go home if I don't fight for this issue. And the reason I could say that with the confidence that I said it with, not was just because it was my individual belief, but because you all have been, path to citizenship has been one of the most high volume, consistent types of calls that you all have been making to my office personally. And so we all have priorities: climate, healthcare, childcare, path to citizenship. We all fight for each other's priorities. But at the end of the day, each one of us has 24 hours. And if we have to say, if we have to bring one thing home, what is that one thing? And the communication that you all gives to us, helps us determine that. And it doesn't mean that we'll just get one thing done. But if I'm taking the point on path to citizenship, and if Jared is taking point on climate issues, EVs, clean energy standards, if Representative Pramila Jayapal is doing point on healthcare and expansion of Medicare, then we will get the agenda that we need. But we need to be able to say that you all are mobilizing, and we need to be able to say, I'm under so much political pressure, I cannot go home without it. Because in Washington, they treat personal preference a lot differently than political reality. And we need you to make it a political reality. So please bring the heat, is all I'm trying to say. Bring the heat on it.
Well, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I am so glad that a couple weeks ago you did raise your voice in caucus, because you were great, and it was great sharing the stage with you today. Thanks so much for joining me in this town hall.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rep. Huffman. I appreciate it.
I want to thank you both for taking the time to explain some of these bills to our constituents. And even more so, thank you to our constituents for asking such amazing questions to clarify some of the bills and the things that are going on in Congress. I just wanted to let you all know that our offices are always open to hear from you. So to reach out to Representative Huffman, please call 415-258-9657 or contact the email that you see on the screen. And for Representative Ocasio-Cortez, please call 718-662-5970 and also use the email listed on the screen. This concludes the Q&A section for the town hall, and we will now be moving on to the press gaggle section. For the press gaggle, if you are a reporter and would like to ask a question, please click the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and state your name and outlet in the question field. Reporters who are selected to be unmuted will ask their questions to the members directly. I will be calling you all out by name, and then someone will then unmute you. It's going to take a second for the names to start rolling in, so we're going to give some of the press just a bit.
We're taking a minute. I just want to also just take a moment to thank all of our interpreters today that have been really helping make our town hall accessible, from our ASL interpreter, Kat, who's there right now, Maria, as well as our interpreters, our English, Chinese, Spanish, Bangla, and Nepali interpreters. Our town hall is now being live cast for two congressional districts in 5 languages, plus ASL and closed captioning interpretation. So thank you so much to all of our interpreters for helping us be accessible to as many people as possible.
Okay, We will now be unmuting Mario Cortez from Eureka Times Standard. This question is for Representative Huffman.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Mario.
Hey, Representative Huffman. So we wanted to know what plans are being developed for the Humboldt Bay offshore wind power projects under Build Back Better, if any.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And Representative Ocasio-Cortez may not know, in the northern part of my district, we've been singled out by the Biden administration as one of the best places for a major offshore wind facility. We're pretty excited about it. And the community has really come together to try to do it in the right way. We haven't done a lot of offshore wind in the United States. This is something that is mainly in Scotland and Portugal and a few other places, especially the floating platform technology that we are contemplating. But we want to be the first one in the U.S., and we want to do it to the platinum standard. Union jobs. We want to include the manufacturing of these huge blades and turbines locally, and to have community benefits, to do it in partnership with fishermen and Native American tribes. So it's one of the most unifying and exciting projects to come along in a region that, frankly, has been struggling for decades to come up with economic development that could fill the void that was left by timber harvesting that went down significantly after the 1980s. So the project is well supported by this administration. I had Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland out to Humboldt Bay to tour it. She supports it. And, we still have to go through the process of the auction and the bidding. But I think our local community-supported project is in great shape to be the first out the gate in what hopefully will become a good kind of offshore energy. We're cleaning up oil in Orange County, unfortunately, because for too long we've allowed the wrong kind of offshore energy and ocean energy development. But we're going to get it right in Humboldt, and I'm very excited about it.
Thank you. Next, we have Kevin Frey from New York One.
Hi there. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, I had two quick questions for you, if I can. One, I know you've toured Rikers and you also got a briefing in the Oversight Committee. Do you want to see a public hearing about the situation at Rikers, which I guess would be kind of one of the potential next steps? Is that something you'd support or that you're talking about? And then when it comes to the climate initiatives, obviously the UN Climate Summit is coming up shortly. If Congress doesn't get anything done on this climate reconciliation related matters over the next couple of weeks ahead of that climate summit in Scotland, what does that say about the US's role in combating climate change on the global stage?
Mm-hmm. Well, these are two excellent questions. I'll start with the first on Rikers. As many in our community know, I went to Rikers earlier this week to really not just tour the facilities and see conditions for myself, but to also have conversations and speak with all sorts of people who are there, from incarcerated persons to correctional officers, jail commissioner, et cetera, to get a better assessment and idea of what is going on there. Now, one of the things that I've heard, and I think there was surprising consensus on several points and issues across the board, but one of those things is that sunlight has improved dramatically what is going on there as we pursue an overall effort to decarcerate. And so, in terms of support for a public hearing, I would absolutely be supportive of that. But what I also want to really make sure doesn't get lost in this is that we have two central issues. There is, of course, the inhumanity that is at the core of mass incarceration that shows up in the actual conditions of Rikers. But there's also the supply side of our court system our DAs, prosecutors, et cetera, and the decisions that are being made in sending people to Rikers unnecessarily, and also keeping them there, keeping people there much longer than they even need to be. And so while I absolutely am supportive of an open hearing on Rikers, I think we should also be having a lot more public discussion about our court systems, our judges, and our DAs, and how this overall system is sending people and New Yorkers to be incarcerated when they shouldn't be. And one very important note, and what I heard from the jail commissioner there, was that our bail reform laws worked. The recidivism rates, contrary to what some of the narratives were, the recidivism rates were low, and we did not see any sort of differences in crime, et cetera, do not correlate with bail reform measures. And they actually helped our situation, didn't hurt our situation. And so in order to get to the bottom of this larger system, I think not only do we need to be examining what's going on at Rikers, but we need to be examining the courts and the conditions and the laws that are sending people there. Oh, and sorry, the second question, I forgot about that. On climate. Listen, the United States, our country has to prove its mettle on climate. And there is very much a concern about going to Glasgow or going to any climate summit, whether it's UN Climate Summit or any other global conversation about emissions. The United States has a lot of pressure right now in order to show that we are not just making a gesture towards climate, but that we are being a global leader. And that if we want to retain the respect and the responsibility of being a global pace setter in emissions reductions, we got to show up and not just talk about it, but we got to be about it, which is why this reconciliation negotiation is so incredibly important. Because I would argue that the fossil fuel industry, I mean, I don't even have to argue it. There was an Exxon lobbyist that is on, whose footage is out there declaring to the world that they are doing everything they can to prevent any sort of check on the fossil fuel industry's power to continue emissions virtually unchecked. Even in this bipartisan bill where there's a gesture towards hydrogen energy is not all created equal. And there's legitimate forms of hydrogen energy that are extremely promising, green hydrogen. But we were just having this discussion. There's also blue and gray hydrogen, because you have to get that hydrogen from somewhere. And you can either get it from a renewable resource or you can get it from fracking. And so even there's, all sorts of different sorts of fossil fuel sources. And so what we're seeing even in, we don't have just the greenwashing of fossil fuels, but also greenwashing of all hydrogen, including fossil fuel hydrogen. And so we have to stop playing games and rhetorical games and handing over the fossil fuel industry a pen to write our national infrastructure packages for us. And so, I do think that we are in a position as a country where there is pressure for us to show up and frankly hand President Biden real legislation that he can help marshal respect and leadership from the global community in drawdown of emissions. And so I do think that this is high stakes.
Yeah. I'm going to chime in a little bit on that last piece because I am going to be part of a delegation in Glasgow at the COP26 summit. And it's super important that we not go to that summit empty-handed. We've got to bring with us really meaningful commitments. And while it's great that we have an EPA secretary who's saying that he's willing to do some rulemaking and put teeth using Clean Air Act and other existing authorities that will help us achieve our emission reductions, we really need Congress to put the money and the policy on the table to back that up. And the worst possible scenario would be that we don't get the Build Back Better Act and its ambitious tax credits and clean energy performance program and other investments, and somehow were to pass only the bipartisan Senate bill, the BIF as we've called it, because it's net negative on climate. It includes new LNG facilities, a bunch of programs that were meant to be for zero emission technology that got opened up to natural gas and fossil fuels, and all sorts of streamlining and NEPA waivers for natural gas. I mean, I could go on and on about the concessions to the fossil fuel industry that were in that Senate bill. That cannot be the only thing that we have on the books in the middle of November when we all get on airplanes and head to Glasgow for the COP26 summit.
Thank you so much, Representative Huffman and Representative Ocasio-Cortez. This concludes our town hall for tonight. But before we sign off, I want to start by extending my gratitude and thanks, first to our constituents for joining us and for your engagement. Your effort and engagement is what allows our representatives to continue fighting the good fight in Congress and to continue to push legislation for you, the people. I also want to thank our transcribers, Amy Lee and Wendy Boer. And lastly, I want to thank our interpreters, Kat Katana, Maria Micchioni, Talish Lopez, Chivita Especial, Edward Lau, Rashawn Ara, Jacob Ali, and Najira Gautam. And again, thank you. You can always contact us at our numbers, 718-662-5970. And for Representative Huffman, 415-258-9657. Have a great evening, everyone. And thank you so, so much.
Thank you. Great job, Kayla.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.